Hello everybody, good afternoon and welcome to the webinar. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar all about the African Association of Business Schools and Emerald case study competition. I know we've got some people who have submitted before and we've got some people who are new to the competition. So Michael Goldman, who is the Editor-in-Chief of Emerging Markets Case Studies, will take you through why write a case study, the rigors of writing a case study, what to look out for, what to pay particular attention to for the competition. And then we are joined by Claire Bernardo, who is the Case Writing Centre Manager at the University of Cape Town Graduate School of Business, who was involved with the winning submission for this year, 2019, to talk you through her experiences on the other side as a competition winner. And then we've also got Gabby, who is our cases publisher, who'll talk to you about how exactly you can go about submitting an entry to the competition. So it should last around 45 minutes today, with some time at the end for questions and answers. However, if you do have any questions as you're going along, please feel free to submit these. So on the right-hand side of your screen on your panel, there's a questions section right at the bottom. So if you click on that, you can ask questions as we're going along, and we can answer those about the relevant themes. So thank you very much again for attending, and I will hand over to Michael now.
Excellent. Good day, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We were excited to spend the next few minutes talking about the competition, talking about quality research cases and the opportunity to publish and to win prizes and really to get global recognition for the kinds of cases that need to be written about entrepreneurs, managers, companies across the African continent. I've prepared a few slides that I hope will help as we think about what it takes to prepare a quality case study and an instructor manual and teaching note as part of that process. But very happy for your questions throughout, so please capture them, send them through, and we'll deal with them as we go through the comments. So if you could pop to the next slide, Carla. So what I've tried to express here is a little bit of the continuum when we think about cases. So, we know from a case research point of view that there are two kind of outputs typically when we do case research. If you think about Yin's work and Stake's work and other scholars that really help us do good case research, we develop a case database, we gather multiple sources of information and data, we triangulate, we do all of that good methodology around case research. And there's really two core outputs. The one is an article that is based on case study methodology, and that might be a single design or multiple design. And those are really important. They're critical to creating theory and developing theory, and that's an important part of scholarship. Our focus today, though, and our focus for this case study competition and the publication of these kinds of cases is more on the teaching side. And so we follow the same methodology, but the output is two documents, right? It's a case study narrative that describes a situation at a point in time facing a protagonist or a set of protagonists, a set of characters in an organization where the dilemma, the decision has not yet been taken. And so the role of the students is to be in the shoes of the protagonist and try and make that decision. So the methodology is very similar in terms of researching the case and putting it together, and it's good, rigorous scientific work, but the output is slightly different. On the teaching case side, on the right-hand side of that slide that you're looking at on the screen, a teaching case typically has the case narrative, right? And so we're looking at about 8 pages on average for a typical case narrative, and then maybe 6 to 8 to 10 to 12 pages of a teaching note or an instructor manual. And this is a critical document for a teaching case because it does two really important things. The first is it helps an instructor use that case in the classroom. And so in terms of adoption, in terms of having our cases have maximum impact in management classrooms around the world, We want to help instructors use the case really effectively. And so that's an important component of the teaching note or the instructor manual. The other component of the teaching note is where we bring in literature, we bring in theory, and we demonstrate our scholarship. So if you think about what a typical article would look like in a typical peer-reviewed publication, a peer-reviewed case study has the same amount of rigor, but they're in different places. And so in the teaching note, that's where the rigor of theoretical application, of part of a lit review, of applying theory and literature and frameworks and models to answer deeper questions related to the dilemma in the case study. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. So as you can see on that slide, the same scientific case study research approach is used. There's just two important different kinds of output, and we're focused on the ones on the right-hand side. Now, the kinds of teaching cases that you find published around the world also on a continuum between more descriptive cases and more decision-focused cases. So descriptive cases tell a story, but they do not have as strong a dilemma or decision at the end that sets up the urgency and importance of a decision that has to be taken by the protagonist. In some publications, descriptive cases are not welcomed. EMCS, Emerging Market Case Studies, as part of Emerald Publishing, we accept cases across the spectrum, but we do find that decision-focused cases where there is a core dilemma, where the solution is not in the case narrative, those are adopted much more internationally. Those are used by many more business schools and professors and students around the world. And so those are often better cases. And if we're thinking about a competition context, I would certainly encourage scholars and authors to focus more on decision-based cases. They are considered within scholarship better case studies because they are more useful in the classroom and they get students more energized and engaged in the learning process. So teaching case studies, they can go on a continuum from descriptive to decision-focused. EMCS accepts all of that kind of teaching case, but from a competition point of view, decision-focused cases are much stronger. So I hope that helps you understand a little bit of the context that we're playing with in the teaching case space. Carl, if we can jump to the next slide, I just want to make a few comments around style, because part of the difference with a teaching case study or a quality case that is used in the classroom is about style. And we know in literature that there are many different types of style, right? If we read the New York Times, if we read the Standard in Kenya, if we read any kind of newspaper or piece of journalism, we get a sense of what the style looks like. Similarly, if we read an Academy of Management journal article, we understand and have an expectation about what that style looks like, which is very different, for example, to the Harvard Business Review, which is still an academic publication, but it has a very different style, right? It's much more accessible to business professionals. It's written in a little bit more of a journalistic style, a little bit more of a narrative. Teaching case studies have quite a distinct literary style. And one of the things we see working with scholars around the world is that it takes a little bit of time and practice for writers to develop this distinctive case study literary style. I think reading lots of quality cases is one way of doing it. Using those cases in the classroom is one way of doing it. Working with experienced scholars is another way of developing that style. But it's a writing literary style. It is about a narrative. So it's about telling a story. And if you think about some of the great documentaries or great films you've watched or great books you've read, you'll recognize that there are aspects of what makes a quality narrative so engaging and appealing. And that's what we're looking to obviously come through as people write their cases. On the next slide, Carla, there are a number of points that I wanted to talk to for a few moments. And again, we're open to your questions as we go through any of these. In a typical case study, and all these kind of points are focused on the case study document, that opening section, that opening 2 or 3 paragraphs, a page or less, is a critical scene setter. If you think about a James Bond movie, for those who are slightly old enough to remember, if you think about one of those, really engaging movies, it's those first few minutes that capture you. They give you a sense of the dilemma. They give you the movies give you the piece of content, gives you a sense of what you can expect and why you should be watching and why you should be paying attention. It's exactly the same in a quality case study. In those first few paragraphs, we set up the protagonist, who is the character. We learn a little bit about the character, not everything about the character, but we learn enough to be able to follow the story. We understand what the dilemma is that's facing that character. Are they about to head into a board meeting where they need to make a really critical presentation about the future of the business? Are they thinking about applying for funding through some kind of private equity or venture capital environment, and they're considering 2 or 3 options? Are they on the shop floor, on the factory floor, and they've just witnessed something that is going to have a massive impact on the operational efficiency of the business, and they need to decide what to do? Have they just walked out of a meeting where the emotions and the interpersonal conflict between their colleagues got to such a point that someone threw a book across the table? What is the dilemma that is facing that character, that's facing that protagonist? What is the big problem that they need to solve within the case? So we introduce that in those first few paragraphs in the opening section, what people often call the opening gambit. We introduce it. We don't go into depth, but we give enough information, right? How long is a piece of string? We give enough information to hook the reader, to capture the reader, so that the reader, the student in this case, wants to learn more. Also in that opening section, we place the case in a certain geography and point in time. So where is this case happening? Is the protagonist in a high rise in Lagos, looking out over the hurly-burly of 4 p.m., 5 p.m. jam in downtown Lagos? And it happens to be mid-2019 as something interesting is happening in the economy. So in those opening paragraphs, we need to have some information about the protagonist, the dilemma or decision or problem that the protagonist and her or his business is facing, and the date and where we are, right? So geography and date is important in that opening section. I love writing the opening section of a case study. My co-authors will tell you that it's something that I will always offer to do first, but it's something I spend days doing because, first draft is easy, but refining it and editing it and thinking about the hook and thinking about style, thinking about how to bring the reader in, how to give enough information, that's an iterative process. And so, I encourage authors to spend quite a bit of time, certainly other instructors who are going to look at a case are going to look at that opening section, and they may make a call on whether they're going to use that case just from reading the first few paragraphs. Students, as we know, who struggle to read anything, we know that students will read the first few paragraphs of a case study and wonder if they need to outsource this to a fellow syndicate or group member, or they need to skim the rest of the case, or they're going to set aside 45 minutes and really focus on this case because they're interested in what the story is about. So that's our role as writers in that opening section, is really to hook the reader in and to bring them into the story. Some thoughts on the narrative in the middle of that slide. And we all have our own distinctive styles, and the idea is not to have a paint by numbers or a carbon copy where everyone writes exactly the same. But there are some broad guidelines that you want to take on board as you develop your narrative. The first thing is that you're always writing in the past tense. So in the opening section, you're establishing, let's say, for example, mid-2019 as the date of the case, the date at which the now, right? The now in the case is mid-2019, and the protagonist is, considering what she's going to do in her board meeting in Lagos. Everything else in the case would happen before that, because if that's the now, then all the other information that we read about in the narrative has to obviously be from before mid-2019. Normally, this is not an issue when we're writing a case that's quite recent, or we place the date of the case quite recent. But sometimes we're writing a case, for example, about mid-2018, and we then need to be really careful that we don't include information in the case study that may have become available after mid-2018. So be very clear on the date and the timeline in the case. And we often see authors get a little bit confused about the timing. When I talk about past tense, it means everything is in the past tense. And so there's no current tense in the narrative. You can't say Nigeria is a major market in Africa. Africa has, almost 1 billion people. Those are present tense, and that's not the way we approach it in the case study. Everything is in the past tense. And the way I like to think about this, if someone picked up your case study in 5 or 10 years' time, it would have to make sense. So if you write a case that says, for example, Nigeria is a leading marketplace in Africa, perhaps in 5 years' time, Kenya has overtaken, or Rwanda has overtaken, or Ethiopia has, overtaken Nigeria, in which case your case doesn't make sense anymore. So we have to write in the past tense. We have to write Nigeria was a leading marketplace, or whatever the sentence might be. So everything is in the past tense. In terms of referencing and sourcing and citations, they are very useful. They're important to do, especially with secondary source data. If you think back to Yin and his guidance on good case study research, we want to have multiple sources of data in our case study. Secondary source data is very, very important. And so when you have secondary source data, reports, newspaper articles, perhaps other academic articles where it makes sense in the narrative, typically not in the narrative, but where it makes sense, it can be good. But typically these are industry reports, they're journalistic reports, it's secondary source data that's out there. Endnotes are a useful way of sourcing that, so it doesn't disrupt the narrative. It's not like a typical article manuscript where most of a paragraph is references as opposed to words. We want the narrative, we want the story to come out, and the sources should be properly referenced and cited via endnotes. Just a comment there on sources. So, as Yin guides us in our case study database and the kind of data that we use to triangulate in good case study research, primary data is, of course, the most important. And if we look at award-winning cases and we look at quality cases that have told some fabulous stories out of Africa over the last few years, the vast majority of those have used great primary data. And by primary data, we mean interviews. We mean interviews with protagonists, perhaps multiple interviews with a number of people within the business. So we get a complete story, we get it from multiple perspectives, and we have multiple voices coming through in the case study. So that's obviously the most important piece of data. And then we have secondary data as well. Storytelling flow. So again, we develop that as we write the case. Think about a golden thread, a red thread. Think about a central thread that goes through the case study. Sometimes we have a great opening section, and then we seem to turn off the storytelling, and we give paragraph after paragraph or section after section of background and context that becomes very dry and boring. And so we need to have the same storytelling approach throughout the case study. Yes, we need to give some background, but if you think about that James Bond or whatever movie that you had in mind, we can tell a bit of a history, we can tell some background, we can give some context without it being boring. Bring the protagonist in, tell the background and the context through the protagonist's eyes, through the protagonist's voice. That's a great way of having a flow through the story. And that's similar to the dilemma thread, as I mentioned. Have that dilemma, that core challenge that's facing the protagonist. Don't just have that come up on page 1 and page 8. It needs to come throughout the case, so that the students, the readers, are continually reminded and are continually deepened into their thinking about the dilemma. Some quick thoughts on language style. It's an objective third person kind of writing, right? So it is, Jack considered doing X, Y, and Z or Z. Jack was, anxious about whatever. When Jack's voice comes through quotations, that's excellent. But the narrative needs to be a more objective third person. The objective piece of that, just remember that we're doing good research here, and although we collaborate with protagonists and with companies in order to get access and to write these cases, it is not a PR piece. It is not a fluff piece. It is not something that the company would write themselves. We need to be more objective. We need to be more independent. We need to do good research. It doesn't mean we're going to put stuff in that the company doesn't want to have put in. We are going to negotiate that as we go through the writing process, and that's a critical part of how we develop these case studies. But we need to be careful about narrative style that is overtly positive towards the company. We want to be more objective, more neutral. Think about an international audience. Think about who you're writing for. You may want to obviously use this in your classroom, and that's excellent. But you also want this case study to make an impact internationally. And part of our research impact as scholars is that the case that we are researching, the case that we're writing up, the teaching note that we're developing makes an impact in classrooms around the world. So think about people sitting in Singapore, in Beijing, in New York, in Sydney. Are they going to be able to understand the case? Are they going to be able to understand the context? Are we writing it in a way that's easily accessible for people anywhere around the world? And then obviously English editing is critical so that it is accessible to anyone. It needs to feel like the same kind of case that they would pick up from anywhere else in the world, even though the context is much more interesting. All right, I've spoken for quite a few minutes now. If there are any questions via the chat function or the question function, please send them through. I'm going to spend another few minutes just talking about one or two more slides and then hand it off. So Carla, the next slide focuses a little bit more on the teaching note. And what we've given you here is, there we go, are a few of the headings, the sections that you would find in a typical teaching note. We have a really nice template, I think, available online. So there's the URL. Look at our author resources section, the cases hub section, for example, that Emerald's developed. Also has a whole bunch of additional resources. So you can look at this in more detail. But as you can see in the teaching note or the instructor manual, and those two terms are quite interchangeable. You'll see the kinds of sections that we have there. Important focus on learning objectives. Think about Bloom's taxonomy. Think about good pedagogics, andragogics, good learning theory that we want to build in. Research method, how you went about writing the case, your primary data, your secondary data, number of interviews, interviews with who, that kind of information. Teaching plan is really important to help the instructor pick up the case study and use it. And then the assignment questions and the model analysis and answers is really where the literature comes in and the analysis comes in. Remember that an epilogue or a postscript is really helpful. You're writing a case at a point in time. continue that story in the epilogue so that the instructor is able to tell the students what actually happened. How did that entrepreneur or that family business or that corporation, how did they solve the problem that's in the case study? We know, right? If you think about a classroom, you think about teaching a great case study, the students are really keen to find out what the answer was, as if there is one answer. And remember, we need to frame this not as the right answer, but it is what the organization happened to decide to do. And then that can obviously lead to a further debate about whether what the company did was smart or not. So include some numbers, include some financials, give a sense of how the company is doing, how the organization is doing once they solved this dilemma that they were facing. The next slide, just a few kind of guidelines before you submit. It's great to teach your case beforehand. You know, we write things and we hear things in our head, but once you've actually taught them in a classroom and you see which questions really work well, how students interpret some of the things that you wrote in a certain way and then they interpret it in a totally different way. So that's a really good practice to teach your case and revise your case. Get some friendly colleague feedback, send it around the department, send it around the building. You know, many of the great business schools, great institutions around the world, you know, scholars don't submit things for publication or for competitions before 3 or 4 people in the building have looked at it and given them some really tough feedback. So use your colleagues, use that collegial environment, make sure you've got some feedback before you do that. It's important to get sign-off from the protagonist or the organization, especially for primary data, so that they are comfortable with what you've put in the case. You don't share the instructor manual or the teaching note with them. You really share the case study with them. That's what they sign off on, because that's the thing that's really published and that's accessible to students. And then make sure it's been comprehensively edited and the style is good. If there's no other questions, I'll just wrap up with 2 quick slides. This next one is a copy of our review guidelines. So these are the kinds of things that reviewers will look at and similarly award judges will look at in terms of what defines a quality case. It's the kind of things we've been talking about, right? The protagonist, the characters, the dilemma, multiple sources, clear structure, written professionally, good teaching objectives, a great teaching plan, and strong analysis. And so you can see there in the review guidelines some of the core aspects that we've mentioned. And then lastly, just looking ahead, you're going to submit great cases. They're going to do really well in the competition, but you may get some feedback and you may get some reviewer feedback or some judges feedback in the competition. How you respond to that feedback is a critical part of scholarship. And so, Carla, the last slide I want to show, the next one, is just some quick guidance on how you respond to feedback. You know, like you would with any, you know, good piece of scholarship, you want to capture the reviewer comments, you want to reflect on those reviewer comments, and you want to respond in detail to each of the reviewer comments. And so, you know, same thing with judges' feedback or reviewer feedback. You want to make sure that you respond professionally to that. But that's a little bit down the line. I hope that's been useful. Open for questions now or later. And if there aren't any, I guess I will hand back.
Thanks, Michael. There were a couple of questions that came through. One of them in particular about that section. So someone was asking, is there a limitation on the timeline? So for instance, if I'm aware of a story that happened 10 years ago, but it's probably not well documented, does it make sense to do a case study more than a decade later, assuming they have the important information now?
That's a really interesting question. My default response would be no, because it's probably going to be quite tough to get that adopted. You know, the kinds of things that play in there are, we know that students love them or hate them. We know that that students struggle to engage with things that they don't feel connected to, that they don't feel are relevant to them. And so we'd need to frame that, and instructors would need to frame an older case quite smartly to be appealing to students. We know instructors similarly are looking for more recent cases than older cases. So that would be the one challenge that I would have with a much older case, if we're talking about more than 6-7 years ago, in terms of the dilemma or the decision point. Now, if there's a decision point in 2018, 2019, 2020, but there's a bit of a history that goes behind that, that's fine. That's a different issue. That's about how we write in the history. And if you think about great movies that you've watched, we can be having a situation, that's playing out in 2019, but we can have some flashbacks to when that person was growing up in 1994. How we tell that story, though, is still engaging, and the flashbacks and the history is not the core of the case. It's just a little bit of background that's built in, sometimes through the voice of the protagonist. So we're not living in the past, we're living in the current, and we're just building in some of that history as we go. So, I think we can head back into history in a more current case and build that as part of a useful dilemma. But if the dilemma is more than 6 or 7 years old, I think it's going to be tough for that case to be engaging in the classroom, and for other instructors to really want to pick that up and use it and have an impact. So I would think twice about that. There would need to be a really, really good reason why one is writing a case about something quite dated.
Great, thank you. And then there was just one more before we hand over, which was what can you add instead of the epilogue when the case is live?
Right. So certainly that's doable. If you're writing something that's happening right now, and when you submit, the solution has not yet been found, or it's not yet public, that's okay. One just then needs to document that as detailed as one can. So, for example, let's say a business in Gaborone in Botswana is weighing up, to do A, B, or C, and you flesh that out in the case study, and the protagonist has to make a decision. But when you press submit and you submit it to the competition, they haven't yet made that decision about A, B, or C. That can just be put into the epilogue that the decision has not yet been taken. This is the way the managers are leaning towards. The analysis in the case study, they did this and this and this. They were thinking about that, but they're waiting for something else to happen before they make a final decision. Something like that. I think that's fine. You just want to, at the point of submission, you want to give the other instructors some guidance about what's happening right now. If we move forward, beyond the competition towards publication, there may be a request by reviewers or by editors in some months down the road to update that epilogue, to update the postscript, and assuming a decision has been made, for example, by mid-2020, when the case perhaps gets published, then there'll be a request to just update that epilogue and see if the solution is clear.
Great, thank you very much. I think that's all the questions we have for now. So I'd like to introduce Claire Bernardo now. So Claire is the Case Writing Centre Manager at UCT Graduate School of Business. And as I mentioned in the introduction, she was involved in the winning case this year.
Thanks, Carla, and thanks very much to Emerald for inviting me to speak and weigh in from our perspective. I thought I'd just start by telling everyone a little bit about our approach and what we're doing. So we really started the centre a few years ago to begin creating local and relevant material. And I think in an emerging market, this is becoming something that's increasing quite a lot. And our desire was really to be able to have our own cases that looked at the realities of business in Africa. And with the Centre as a resource, we've started to put together cases, and I think the AABS competition is a really good an example of setting yourself a goal, and it just gives that platform and encouragement, you know, in collaboration with Emerald to put a good case together. Our current collection, we've got over 40 cases, and I think one thing that all of our cases have is teaching notes. So that is something that we always focus on. And then these cases are used in our classroom in Cape Town, and then of course also internationally around the world. So I think the beauty of the case method is that it can be picked up throughout the world and be taught with from professors all over the world. And then I thought maybe something that would be of interest to everybody is just in terms of a winner's perspective, would be some shortcuts and just some top tips on things that we do focus on in terms of our competition application. So on the next slide, just to share a few of these, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to chat more to try and answer them. But I think I put at the start, getting the company consent up front. I think for us, we've realized that it's really important to establish that commitment from the get-go. It really sets the tone for the type of primary data that we will get, and also the buy-in from the company in terms of what the purpose of the case is in the bigger picture. So I tend to put quite an emphasis on that in the beginning, and generally companies are willing to publish their stories and their dilemmas, so I find that quite encouraging. I've had very few companies that haven't actually wanted to go on to do this. And then from the get-go, we really look at planning the entire structure. So looking at it from a bird's eye view and knowing where the case will sit and where the teaching note, everything that's going to go together in terms of the puzzle, but not starting to write or even collect any data until we know what the entire structure looks like. And I think this we're becoming more rigorous with, and it's really helps in terms of starting to write the actual case and then put the different pieces together. So for me, it's about finding that clarity on what are the teaching objectives. So where will this case be taught? And I think that is the point, the entire point of a teaching case is that it goes on to be used in the classroom. So instead of writing the case first and then the teaching note afterwards, we're already thinking about where it will live and how it will be taught by professors around the world. And then any theory that links those together. So what is the theory that is being taught in the classroom? And then just from a writing point of view, we combine both primary and secondary data. I find that the primary data is really, as Michael was saying, where you get the detail and the real nuances. And then the secondary data just gives you different perspectives also. So it gives you a way to kind of add different layers to the narrative. And it's really about then threading those together. And then in terms of writing, really paying attention to detail in the case. So the case for me is really about writing up the draft and then crafting it and then spending a lot of time polishing it and then making sure in the final proof that there are no errors. So it's different stages of writing. It's not a simple sitting down and writing it out once. It's coming back to it and crafting it. But that attention to detail really helps in terms of how the reader will take the case and also how it will be used by the professor and how it will be gripping and compelling. So I hope that those are just a few tips. It's quite a process to write a case and a good teaching note. one more is that I do like to think of the deadlines involved, because I have had cases that have run away with me and with time, and I think that it's also good to set yourself some good deadlines and to know how long you have and where the beginning and the end of the process will be.
Thank you so much, Claire. That was really, really interesting. And as Claire mentioned, if you do have any questions, please do type them in the question pane. Alternatively, you can always email us afterwards if you've thought of anything afterwards. We will get back to you as well. So I'm just going to hand over now to Gabby. So Gabby is the case's publisher. Some of you will know Gabby, and she will just take you through the practical side of submitting to the competition, and then we'll come back for any more questions.
Thanks, Carla. And thank you, Michael and Claire, for your time and your contribution to this. Everything you've said has been really helpful. So thank you for that. So I was just going to talk, give a little bit more background on kind of the practicalities of how to submit to the AABS competition this year. So all cases will need to follow the standard EMCS guidelines that are linked to on this page here. They're available on our website, and submissions are through the Scholar One system, so the first link that's on the page there. If you've submitted to EMCS before, it will be a fairly familiar submission process. The only things you need to be aware of is that under step 5, there's a question: please select the issue you are submitting to, and just make sure that you select the AABS competition from that option. But again, it's a fairly self-explanatory process. There is a question if you want to be considered on the crowd review pilot. Just press no to that because it's not applicable to the AABS case competition. Like I said, there is full submission criteria on our website on the second link that's on the page there. We've also got the hub, which is available at caseshub.emeraldgrouppublishing.com. So there are modules on there on how to write a case study, different stages throughout how to kind of develop a protagonist, which Michael touched on earlier on, all the way through to kind of how to take on board reviewer feedback and revise a case before resubmitting it. So more kind of submission criteria for AABS competition specifically. Cases should only be submitted by those primarily based at an African business school, and all submitted case studies must be derived from a real life situation in Africa. If you do have any queries on whether or not you meet this criteria, please do email me sooner rather than later. So if it is just something you're considering submitting and you're not sure about this, let me know before you submit, and it kind of gets through that process initially. Claire mentioned this as well, that getting case study consent from the business that your case focuses on, getting this this consent as soon in the process as you can is really helpful. Again, you kind of don't want to have this submitted and be going through various rounds of review before you realise that not having that consent can be a big issue further down the line. And all cases submitted to this competition will be considered for publication EMCS via the usual EMCS review process. So it's important that you've not submitted this elsewhere. Again, this will be a question that you're asked on the submitting on the Scholar One system when you are submitting it. So just make sure that it's not submitted elsewhere, even for another regular journal. If you have any questions, again, about if your case is eligible, please let me know. Sorry, I'm just checking, is there a question there? Oh. Yes, and then just know on emerging markets case studies more generally. This is where all the successful cases will be published. So beyond the competition, we welcome submissions at any point to this collection. It covers all business and management disciplines in an emerging market. Also beyond the competition prizes, all accepted cases will receive a payment of £100. So that's if it's accepted but not a winning case, or if it is a winning case, this will be on top of the prize. So there will be a payment of the equivalent of £100 upon publication. And then I'm also interested to discuss any other opportunities. So if anyone listening is interested in becoming a reviewer or is interested in perhaps guest editing any special issues, please do get in touch with me and see if there is anything that I can do to help. And then I just wanted to stress as well, the deadline for this is the 28th of February. So there is a fair amount of time before then, but I mean, Claire mentioned that as well, being able to work to a deadline should hopefully kind of be a motivating thing for you all. So I don't know if there are any questions on anything kind of practical at all.
Thank you very much, Gabby. So hopefully that's given you a bit of an overview of why you want to write a case, what happens when you successfully win the competition, and some practicalities about how to submit. We've also got a few more questions coming through, so I'll take those. But just so you know, we will share the slides and also all of the links to the relevant resources afterwards. And also with anyone that couldn't make the webinar, please feel free to share the recording with any colleagues you think would benefit from that. So just a couple of questions to go through here. We've got a question here. Can you please confirm that we should put references on hand notes? So I'm not sure, if you could just clarify that a little bit more, Alex, that would be great. So we've got another question here about how do you flesh out fact from fiction in the cases? So assume you are dealing with a firm which is sensitive about its information getting to competitors, and you have reason to believe that not all the information is accurate. So maybe one for you, Michael.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think there's different words we need to clarify here. Fictional cases are extremely tough to publish anywhere. And so I wouldn't encourage any writing of fictional cases, right? Disguised cases are a totally different thing. And so if we're working with an organization and there are some concerns about some of the data points or some of the information, it is certainly acceptable for some information in the case to be disguised. Now, we don't have time to go into all the depth around disguising, and I'm happy to pick that up with anyone. But typically what you're doing is you're thinking of comparative or equivalent kinds of businesses or industries or market contexts, and you're taking the real protagonist, real case, real company, and you're putting it somewhere else, and you're disguising it in that way. And so there's different extremes of disguise. At the end of the day, the nature of the disguise needs to be detailed in the method section in the teaching note, and you still need company sign-off on the case study that has been disguised so that the company is comfortable that what is being published is an effective disguise based on real information. So it's not fictional, it is disguised, it's based on real, and it has been effectively disguised so that it is not entirely clear who the company is in that marketplace, or perhaps which market it is, or perhaps what some of those numbers are. And so I think that's certainly acceptable. In terms of the other question about information that you're getting from the protagonist or from the company that may not be true, that's where Claire's comment earlier about triangulation and using multiple data points is really helpful. What I've certainly done in the past and seen with some quality cases is you'll have the voice of the protagonist, you'll have the voice of the company coming through, and that they may push one kind of point within the case, and you can balance that in your narrative perhaps with some secondary sources that suggest some alternate views on, for example, the prospects for the business, or the likelihood of a new product succeeding, or the extent of market share growth that's expected when they do X and Y. And so that also makes the case a little bit more objective and independent, where you're not just relying on what the company's saying, you're checking and balancing that with some external data as well. So I hope that's a kind of a quick answer to that question. Happy to discuss that specifically further as well.
Great, thank you. And we've got a question here for Gabby, which is, when do submissions begin and can they submit more than one case study?
Okay, so submissions, the system will be open as of tomorrow. So like I said, that question, please select the issue you're submitting to, select the AABS competition. As of tomorrow, that will be available. And there's no limit in how many case studies that you can submit. Again, obviously, we understand that there might be a bit of overlap in terms of you might have 2 case studies on kind of similar themes. So long as there's nothing kind of concerning in terms of that crossover, there is absolutely no limit on how many you can submit. So yeah, I would encourage you, go for it.
Great, thank you very much. I think actually that's all of the questions for now, other than there was a sort of generic few questions just about the subject areas that we cover. So Gabby, I don't know if you just want to sort of reiterate what we cover.
Yep, bear with me just 1 second. So it's probably best if I go through, again, one of the questions on submission will be the subject area. So if I just kind of read these out, it might give a kind of good overview, and then if Michael wants to add anything afterwards. So the options that you kind of have to select from are accounting and finance, built environment, entrepreneurship, environmental management, international business, human resources, management science, marketing, operation and logistics, public sector management, strategy, and tourism and hospitality. So they're kind of the set topics you have to select from. I don't know if Michael wanted to expand on that, but I think that kind of answers the question there.
Yeah, I mean, from my side, you think about a typical business program, management program at an undergrad or grad level program in a typical business school or economics department at any of our universities across the continent. And you find typical subject areas, right? Typical topics. Those are the topics that cases are typically written in. Now we know that business life is sometimes complex and multidisciplinary. And so the issues that you can be writing about in a case might cross more than one topic area. But focus is really, really helpful. And so when you develop a case study, think about which class are you going to be teaching that in, which course, which module, which topic, which subject, and that's got to be the core around the case. That's what your teaching note is about. That's what your learning outcomes are focused on. And so, we know that there's fabulous stories to be told about great entrepreneurs and companies in interesting situations across the continent. We want to capture those, but when we write them into the case, we want to focus in on one slice of that situation. And it's typically a classroom-focused, topic-focused slice.
Great, thank you very much. So again, just to say that we will be in touch with all of you that attended, following up with all of the relevant links. A quick reminder that the deadline for the competition itself is the 28th of February next year. But as Gabby said, best to start thinking about it sooner rather than later, so that you can sort of cross off all of the practical side of it and then hopefully have a better chance of being successful in the competition. So once again, thank you so much for your time. When the recording comes around, please feel free to share that as widely as possible, and good luck with your submissions. Thank you very, very much to Michael, Claire and Gabby. It's been really, really useful for everybody. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. And hope to see a lot of great submissions from you all. So thanks very much for attending, and have a lovely rest of your day.